Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Charles, and welcome to you all dotted around the world, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Warm welcome. It's actually extremely warm. I'm in the French capital, and the current thermometer reading is 32 degrees centigrade. So I think that might just sort of add to the feeling that it's the time to talk about African politics and the pandemic. It's actually 4 degrees hotter here than it is in Lagos right now, I'm told. The theme is really how the pandemic has affected African societies, and I'm going to deal primarily with the political risk and the security elements of it. And of course, Stuart, who is just one of the superlative economic analysts on Africa and the Middle East and a lot of other places, is going to take on with the real detail. I think the first thing I wanted to say is that the pandemic is an accelerator. That is to say, all the things that we thought were happening, and we knew in some cases were happening prior to January 2020, like economic nationalism, like a US-China trade war, like digitalization, taking traditional jobs, forcing people online, retail outlets weakening, and demographic change, particularly in Africa, which I think is going to be a recurrent theme of political realities going forward. All those things were happening. What the pandemic has done, though, is to really put its foot down on those. So to some extent, I think you could say that there's a bunch of positives. That is to say, governments and private sector providers are getting a lot more serious about digitalization, and you're seeing companies going digital faster. You're seeing governments digitize their archives, digitizing their services. I think out of 54 countries in Africa, at least 20 are now collecting some of their revenue digitally. And the importance of that is that there's just less leakage. And of course, revenue collection is again, it's a recurrent economic theme, because countries are looking at non-traditional means of boosting the treasury coffers. Then the other positive, I guess, would be the focus on national production. I'm making a distinction between that and economic nationalism. That is, countries are looking at ways of becoming less import dependent. I mean, the outstanding example of that, I guess, is Nigeria. And of course, you can argue about how effective it's been, but it was certainly one of President Buhari's founding philosophies, that Nigeria must be self-sufficient in food production. It spends, I think, around 8 to 10, or was spending at its peak, around $8 to $10 billion on imported food a year. And they claim to have cut that by a huge amount so far. So those trends were exaggerated and reinforced by the pandemic. At the same time, as we've seen around the world, particularly in the United States and India and Brazil, the big population countries, the negative effects of the pandemic have been equally clear, and that's the laying bare the social inequities that we all knew were there, but the differential treatment, the differential life chances of populations have been exposed far more brutally and far more starkly during the pandemic. And as is also apparent from a recent report from the UN HIV/AIDS organization, some states have turned to repression to police their pandemic restrictions. And there have been some stark cases of people very badly wounded, and some fatalities in Nigeria, in Kenya, and South Africa, and other countries, and certainly, of course, Zimbabwe too, by police who say they're enforcing the pandemic regulations, and so on. So in terms of the actual health crisis in Nigeria, Africa's got away with, as the continent least affected. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. It should be affected, not effected, by the public health emergency. It's got, one is knocked up, according to CDC, 1.36 million cases on Monday, and 32,795 deaths also on Monday. And that's the CDC working with the John Hopkins facility in Washington, D.C. And those are about the most accurate figures we can lay our hands on at the moment. That compares with India, with a register. India and Africa have roughly about the same populations. That is the whole of the African continent, all 54 states, and India have about the same population. But in India, they have at least 5 million registered cases and over 80,000 deaths. So the caveat there, of course, is the data in both India and in many African states is wanting. The CDC has done some interesting work drilling down and looking at particular caseloads, and they have come up with an approximation that 85% of the COVID-19 cases in Africa may be asymptomatic. People walking around who have contracted the virus but don't know they've got it. Well, it's good for them because they're not suffering. The danger of that, of course, is it does open up the possibility of more rapid spread than hitherto, but that hasn't yet been the case. But if you follow through that logic, according to the CDC, as many as 14 million people could actually have the COVID-19 virus in Africa, although only 1.36 million have tested positive with their state authorities so far. But beyond the public health damage of the pandemic is the collateral damage, and look at three different areas. The first one is the public health system. Already many of these public health systems were creaky. What has happened this year is that treatments of malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS have all been cut sharply because of the focus on the pandemic. Could we go to the next slide? Thanks. That put most starkly, the Gates Foundation came out with a pretty worrying figure yesterday. They said in 2019, last year, a record 85% of the world's children received all the vaccines recommended by the World Health Organization. That's 85%. Now, their measurements this year so far is that figure has fallen to 70%, the lowest since 1995. So that shows you how quickly public health provision has fallen because of this focus on the pandemic. So in a way, African governments are having to focus on traditional health threats more than the pandemic, because that is where the damage is really being done. Another threat to those governments is this issue of vaccine nationalism, and to what extent will they be able to get access and afford access to the vaccines when they come onto the market, despite the bombast in some countries. It looks more likely, we're talking about early 2021 earliest, but the question is then, who gets the priority? Is it going to be health workers? Is it going to be governments? Private sector? Who? And all those arguments are in play. And the other collateral damage in terms of public service is the closure of schools and colleges in Africa. And that's had a heavier effect in Africa than elsewhere because of the lack of digital access in many countries. So the elite schools and colleges across the continent have done fine. Students are either enrolled in private colleges or whatever, or overseas colleges, they've continued. But the grassroots schools in the hinterland have really been hit, and they've had to close. So that's a real worry. Thanks. On the economics, I'll be very brief on this because that is, Stuart is going to lead on this. The African Development Bank put out a gloomy forecast at its annual general meeting last month. It reckons the continent is going to lose 173 billion out of its projected GDP, which Stuart would have the figures on top of his head. But I mean, that looks to me like, pushing for 10% of an average loss across the continent. And actually, the ADB talks about losing 237 billion next year. It's interesting, the IMF, for once, is actually a little bit more bullish than the ADB, says that Africa is going to take about 3.2% hit this year, but it could, 3.2% hit this year, but it could bounce back 3.4%. I'm skeptical that any of these organizations really have really got it right, and because they've been revising these figures so often. National debt are going up, and despite the G20's offer to stall debt payments this year and early next, many countries are going to encounter repayment problems. And in terms of the political outcome of all this, watch the effect on the vast majority of the population, the 85% of people who work in the informal sector, who have no protection, who have no health insurance, who have no, are not part of pension schemes or all the rest of it. They're going to be hit very hard, and that's evident from the mounting social discontent in many countries. We're seeing that in many ways, in terms of street demonstrations. And just a word on the street demonstrations. And I mean, politics is changing, and we're kind of we tend to focus on, who's marching through the center of Paris or London and New York or Washington. What you're seeing more and more in Africa is mini demonstrations, not in the capital cities, but in the outlying areas, targeting local officials for inefficiency, corruption, or worse. And you're seeing a lot of that. South Africa, for example, lockdown or no lockdown, there have been a succession of small micro demonstrations, which is like eating away at the government's, the standing of President Cyril Ramaphosa's government. And that trend is, is spreading across the continent. Same in Zimbabwe, same in Sudan, where you saw the incredible revolution last year. That started at local and regional level. You're seeing that in a lot of countries. Ditto in Mali. The activism, civil society activism that then led to a military putsch. Politics is not just for the likes of the journalists and pundits to bang on about. It's not a middle-class coffee shop conversation. Increasingly, it's linked absolutely to livelihoods. Governments are being judged ever more harshly on the economic performance of their countries. So to that extent, I think Africa is following the Asia model much more closely in terms of political perceptions. Just, you cannot run a bad economy for very long in many Asian countries. Maybe the Philippines might be an exception, but somewhere like South Korea, for example. And I think a lot of African political movements have been extremely impressed by what happened in South Korea, given that Korea was pegging level with Africa in the Great Independence decade in the 60s. So that sense of linking politics to economic outcomes is very, very important in Africa. The other element, again, is an accelerating element, is the social media one. That access to education, access to digital communication plus actually access to secondary education, is increasing activism. That ties in also with the increasing urbanization. So urbanization both in the capitals and in the regional cities and around the regional cities. So there is more political organization. It's taking new forms. And it's being felt in different ways in the main political parties that are sounding off more about nationalism than ever they had before. And that's nationalism in many ways. Nationalism in terms of skepticism of the big players in the world economy. That's both the US, a more traditional target for nationalists, but also China as an increasing pushback against some of China's companies in Africa, but also in some cases against other countries in the region. For example, if you look at Southern Africa, many countries feel that South Africa is playing a negative role in the region. It's becoming this sort of hegemon where they don't care for. So you've got that nationalism, you've also got that localism, and the localism is communicated, it's relayed in terms of both community and ethnic solidarity, which become increasingly important factors for political mobilization. That again is turning into more electoral and political disputes. So you've had the situation in Malawi, where in a quite outstanding judgment, the Supreme Court annulled a bad election in 2019 and presided over a new one, which by all accounts was freer, much freer and fairer, and the result was accepted widely. I think you're going to see the courts in Ghana play a big role. This year, they played a very big role in 2012. If there is any dispute, it's going to be litigated through those courts. You may see the same going on in Guinea and Côte d'Ivoire. On the corruption angle, I think it's worth saying that a lot of people had predicted that the pandemic's pressure on economies would force this focus on revenue and therefore sort of lift the sheet to uncover a lot of dodgy, corrupt business, political dealings. To some extent, that's happening. And it also goes into some of the awareness people have through social media and new forms of political mobilization that they can communicate news and information about corruption. But the other thing that we have seen in stark detail were officials capitalizing on the pandemic in South Africa. $1/3 of $1 billion worth of contracts went out to uncompetitive bidders, overpriced contracts and the rest in South Africa. And that was a real wake-up call for the Ramaphosa administration. And I think this last few weeks in South African politics, if you've been following it, where Ramaphosa stands up at the African National Congress, National Executive Committee and says, we can't go on like this. We're betraying the people. The African National Congress is, first and foremost being judged corrupt in the court of public opinion. All of that, which he couldn't have said a year ago, he was saying because of the corruption related to procurement for health equipment to deal with the pandemic. You've seen similar things going on in Kenya. In Zimbabwe, the health minister is on trial for a corrupt deal thought to be related to the president, but the health minister is taking the hit for it. Zambia, the health minister has gone on trial for corruption. The court exonerated him. Kenya, there are a bunch of officials facing corrupt charges there. So, it's a mixture. There's more activism, there's more knowledge and communication about corruption, and governments are under more pressure to act. They really feel under pressure. On the matter of the insurgents, I sound a few warnings there. Both sides in Libya have agreed this ceasefire. We've been there many times before between the Tripoli administration of al-Sarraj and the Benghazi administration of the rogue general Khalifa Haftar. Whether or not it holds, and Haftar seems to have a lot of local political problems, perhaps from an Islamist faction, but he faces problems within his administration in Benghazi. Even if that ceasefire holds, cut between maybe Turkey and Egypt, the respective backers of both sides, what is likely to happen is a lot of those well-armed militias fighting on one side or the other in Libya may head south for new work in the Sahel, working with the many armed insurgent groups in the Sahel. So that we've seen it before with the overthrow of Gaddafi. It was the overthrow of Gaddafi that sent a wave of militias southwards to restart the wars in the Sahel in the early 2010s. So there's a warning there. The Sahel is still ablaze with insurgency. We've seen what's happening in Mali, which was partly responsible for the military putsch because the government was mishandling its response to the threat of the insurgents. But equally, Burkina Faso, we'll talk about the election in a bit, but that's the insurgents have swept across Burkina Faso. Niger is still vulnerable also, and there are signs that the insurgents of the Sahel, the Islamic State in the Sahel, are joining up with the other insurgent group in the neighborhood, the Islamic State of West Africa Province, which has been operating in northeastern Nigeria and northwest Cameroon, with affiliate links with Daesh, Islamic State Central. So that's a continuing concern. The Eastern Congo militia wars, very much linked to gold mining and so on, are continuing. The Rwanda-Burundi tensions continue. About a third of the Rwandan Defense Force is deployed on that border. They're taking it very seriously. The insurgency in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado is probably, in terms of corporate interest, is top of the list at the moment, because that is the site of Africa's biggest gas project, biggest infrastructure investment project. That's digging the gas both offshore and onshore in that region. And the insurgents, what started as a local rebellion, is now bringing in, it is said, affiliates again from Islamic State. And the fact that there are French companies involved, ExxonMobil's involved as well, Total is involved, that makes the pickings a lot more important for an international jihadi group. And at the same time, Al-Shabaab continues to bomb the Somali people and the government. So I mentioned earlier the economic nationalism has been gaining ground. That's been reflected in countries like Tanzania and Zambia, where they have been pushing up the demands on corporate tax and mining royalties. But at the same time, what you're seeing, and Magufuli has had some success in that regard, but what you're seeing at the same time, the biggest economies on the continent, the Nigeria, the biggest, South Africa, the second biggest, strapped for cash, are really reconsidering their investment offer. And there are signs that, for example, in Nigeria, the petroleum industry bill, which is inching its way to the legislature, is meant to be making a more investor-friendly offer to the big oil companies, having realized, now they have the officials realize that there's a real battle between oil providers, oil producers in Africa and the Middle East to get the new investment in to push up production. South Africa, ditto. the balance between South Africa's sense that the inequities are down to foreign investors as much as the legacy of the apartheid system is still very strong politically, but Ramaphosa, no mean businessman himself, he owns the franchise to McDonald's hamburgers and a number of other big, had a number of other big interests before he went back into politics, is trying to woo over international investors with a more investor-friendly offer. Ditto, Kenya, Rwanda, and Ghana are all looking at ways to restructure state assets. That's privatization programs. We'll get into some of the details of that in the country-specific stuff. Just to say, plaudits to Senegal, the Foreign Policy magazine ran a poll of medical experts asking people how they thought countries had handled the pandemic and its social problems. Senegal came second in the world, only to New Zealand. And South Africa, which actually got a lot of plaudits early on in the process, became less well regarded later, came 12th in the poll, I should add. Governments are responding to loss of this loss of support. The general view is that virtually all governments have lost support in this period because the pandemic has hit people's livelihoods, and often the government reaction, I mean, after the initial community solidarity, we're all in this together, they felt that governments, and this, I think it's certainly the case in the West, we don't need to mention all the names, that there's been a hypocrisy on the government part, on the part of some government officials who have said, yeah, there are rules there for you guys, not for us. There's a feeling in many African countries that's the attitude of the governments there. But sort of again, on the accelerator and metaphor, those regional pressures that Ethiopia faced in Tigray and Oromo region have intensified, and ditto, its confrontation with Egypt over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has also intensified. The reason for the row over the dam, I think now, is that it's a matter of time, and because of the floods in Africa, the Egyptians are convinced that the Ethiopians are quietly and surreptitiously filling the dam. The Ethiopians are saying, no, it's just actually, it's just heavy rainfall. But the fact that the US has thrown its hat into the ring on that one, and has suspended over $100 million of aid to the Ethiopian government till it reaches a settlement with Egypt. Given the closeness between the Egyptian president and the US president, that's a significant move, I think. That adds to the problems facing Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who started so well and now faces a growing problems at home and abroad. The governments of Zambia and Zimbabwe are cracking down hard. Again, this is very much related to weak economies and the sense of rising regime corruption and regime impunity, or certainly impunity for the ruling class and the ruling party. Uganda is interesting. Yoweri Museveni is one of the longest standing leaders in Africa. And he came to power at the head of a guerrilla movement in 1986. He's standing again next year, and he's managed to mix authoritarian rule with a somewhat paternalistic response to the pandemic. It appears to be getting away with it. Uganda has just signed this $3.5 billion pipeline deal with Tanzania, backed by France's Total. It was poo-pooed initially by the oil companies, who said you should be going through Kenya, it's much cheaper, much faster, and all the rest of it. But so this is a deal between, if you like, two authoritarian populist rulers, sort of mixing a bit of economic nationalism with a bit of old-fashioned paternalistic politics. That is Museveni and Magufuli. I've mentioned on the medium term, the positive pushback, I mentioned this pushback on, this pushback on push for local production, that's certainly accelerating. The digital economy, likewise. And I think I'm right in saying the latest figures are over 500 million smartphones, or what they call semi-smartphones, are operating accounts in Africa. And partly because of the importance of mobile money as well in Africa. So it's becoming one of the most connected continents in terms of the daily use of Wi-Fi. So governments are following up. There is more investment in public Wi-Fi. There's more investment in cheaper packages and better infrastructure by the telecom companies. Lastly, power supply is being boosted by both the sustainable energy off-grid projects and also the increasing, the longer term investment in national grids. So you've got some countries that are actually energy positive and have surplus energy. I mean, Ghana is a good example over the next 10 years. The demographics are important. Yes, you know, there's a big argument about the three-term thing, or the multi-term tendencies. It's true, there is a gerontocracy across the continent that wants more, that is angling for more terms in power. But equally, I think if you look elsewhere in the political systems, there is a group of professional, determined politicians, officials coming up through the system that are making demands and again, are looking and comparing the performance of their countries with the performance of the countries in Asia and Latin America, and wanting to go, you know, to go through the gears and boost their performance. The stark demographics that Africa is going to have the biggest labor force in the world by 2050, that is overtaking India and China. On one level, great, you know, it's great for the market. On the other level, if the jobs don't go with that is a huge, obviously a huge political risk. Part of the response to that political risk has been the acceleration of the negotiations for the African Continental Free Trade Treaty, which comes into force early next year, which will offer substantial opportunities. Last point I would mention, we already have an African, Ethiopian Tedros, running the World Health Organization. The two front-running candidates in the race to head the World Trade Organization is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria, Amina Mohammed from Kenya, are well placed. And then the third organization is the International Finance Corporation, where the executive director is leaving at the end of this year, and the two candidates to replace him, that's Vera Songwe from the Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa, or Franny Lutier, who's with Southbridge at the moment. Both those two candidates are well placed, again, to replace. So just a few warning signs. You can't get around the economic damage and the political damage that's going to do as these effects work their way through the system. There are going to be some tough trade-offs between public health investment, which is everyone is talking about, and other budgetary concession. I mean, for example, Nigeria, country of 200 million people, whose public health system needs a radical revamp, but has embarked on a $20 billion infrastructure investment plan. How do they balance those two areas, quite apart from the need to modernize and professionalize the security forces, the police, the army, and the intelligence services, in a region where the risk of insurgencies is rising? I mean, those are the issues these successive governments are going to have to juggle. The rising unemployment everywhere, South Africa and Nigeria are now level pegging in terms of underemployment and unemployment, but you're finding mirror images of those sort of figures in proportion across the continent. And that is, if the jobs are not forthcoming and the private sector is not able to create them, I think you're going to see a lot more activism, and the government will not have the resources to do the job creation it has been able to do in the past. So I've said already, governments except Senegal, most governments have been losing popular support. And then you're seeing, I haven't seen any figures recently, but the sense of, anecdotal sense, at least from talking to friends, that a lot of skilled workers and middle-class students are saying, look, if this pandemic is going to continue, I'm really going to think. I mean, a couple of mates have just moved to North America as a result. So I've got maybe 5 minutes more. Charles, is that all right? I'll just wing through these specifics, but you'll get the PDFs and feel free to ask any questions. I think I've included Nigeria in that because when it comes to states in Nigeria, many states in Nigeria have the population of a regular African country. The ones to watch are the Edo state, which is sort of a part of honorary member of the South-South, the Niger Delta group of states, and of course the historic capital of the Benin Empire. It's been an extremely rough election so far, partly because the sitting governor, Godwin Obaseki, has changed horse, and he's gone to join the opposition party after falling out with the former chairman of the ruling party. That election is coming up this Saturday. I think it's going to be a fairly heated affair. The other election is Southwest Nigeria, Ondo State. Again, it's pitting the two main parties, ruling APC against the opposition PDP, against each other. I think both of them are essentially about the people behind each candidate and how they come out of it. So essentially, if the PDP win in Edo and Ondo, that is going to benefit Wike, the governor of Rivers State, and maybe Tambuwal, the governor of Sokoto State. These are contenders for the presidency in 2023. Ditto, if the APC candidate wins in those two states, it's going to benefit Bola Tinubu, who is the former Lagos governor who's angling to become the APC candidate in 2023. Opaque campaign funding, I'd say a slight joke. I mean, a Nigerian friend rang up and was asking about the US elections, and he was wondering, so I think we should send some of our guys as campaign advisors, just in terms of what's been going on in terms of talk about the use of the Supreme Court, militias, and all the rest of it. But it's not going to be a happy election season, I don't think, in Nigeria. And again, I think the worry there is that the election bill has not gone through. So there are faults in the electoral system, and if those are not corrected ahead of the presidential election in 2023, that's building up more trouble. So perhaps the next slide, please. Côte d'Ivoire, President Alassane Ouattara, former deputy managing director of the IMF, got a stellar technocratic record. However, and he was all set to throw in the towel, and then his anointed successor, Gon Coulibaly, unfortunately died in July. So Ouattara had a hard think about this and came to the conclusion that he didn't think anyone else, after his preferred successor had died, anyone else but him was qualified to go on. So he's used this constitutional arrangement, so it's still debated within Côte d'Ivoire, to get himself a third term. And that has created a huge pushback from his political opponents. He was in Paris last week, saw Emmanuel Macron, who said, who apparently, we hear, advised him that why don't you use this opportunity to negotiate a sort of an agreed exit for all the, you know, the elder generation, the esteemed elders of Ivorian politics. That's Ouattara, Henri Konan Bédié, and Laurent Gbagbo, all former presidents, all of whom are kind of playing one role or another. Ouattara uncharacteristically spurned Macron's advice and is pressing ahead. I think there are concerns that it could get quite ugly. It's already got a bit ugly. We have demonstrations and protests, and people have been killed and wounded in those. That's a real concern about political stability and how it affects the regional economy. Tanzania, I've mentioned Magufuli's economic nationalism and his, I guess you have to say, skillful negotiation tactics, presented Barrick Gold with a bill for $80 billion in back taxes. While they didn't pay it, it maybe was a sort of equivalent of a bizarre negotiation, that is bazaar negotiation, and they pushed it down to $500 million or whatever, but he got away with it. He's regarded by his supporters as being this hard-nosed nationalist and extremely hard on corruption. There's some truth in that. He's also absolutely authoritarian. He's presided over a national electoral commission, which just disqualifies opposition candidates. And I mentioned also that Tundu Lissu, who is one of the very able opposition candidates, was shot 15 times 18 months ago in what many are certain was a political hit. And he had to go overseas. He's now back in the country. He's standing. The sad thing for the opposition is they have not been able to agree on a common candidate. So I don't think they're going to make much headway against Ghana. The conventional wisdom is that the New Patriotic Party is so far ahead. It won by a million votes in 2016, that it's going to be impossible for John Mahama, the candidate for the National Democratic Congress, to catch up with them because he hasn't been able to campaign much. The NDC out of government doesn't seem to have much of a war chest. So I think you've got to say that Akufo-Addo is the favorite to win. It doesn't mean to say it's going to be as seamless as an election as it was last time, because the NPP had a really impressive vote counting, vote monitoring system, which enabled them to call the election, despite some hocus pocus going on in the Electoral Commission, it seems. This time, I don't think it's going to be anything like as uncontroversial, shall we say. And I can imagine some of the NDC guys are going to cry foul. And there's also the difficulty of running an election with the backdrop of the pandemic. There's also rows over this new royalty company, which we can talk about if anyone's interested in that later. Burkina Faso, last country on the list. Again, I think the worry there is two big factors: the insurgency and the pandemic are going to deter turnout. So rather than a national election, although that's what it is billed at, national presidential and parliamentary elections, you're going to see effectively an election in Ouagadougou and in Bobo Dioulasso. And it's not, so we're not really looking at the sort of the full-throated political mobilization and campaigning we saw in 2016. That may enable Kabore to win, but few people think that he's going to win on the first round. And his danger then, a bit like Ouattara's danger in Côte d'Ivoire, is if he doesn't win on the first round, then all the opposition parties, there's about 21 of them, will then unite to oppose him on the second round. And he, given the government's performance, both on the pandemic, but particularly on failing to provide security, good enough security against the insurgents, there's a strong possibility he could lose. So there you have it. That's the big picture, and then the elections. Thanks very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Indeed, and we now turn over to Stuart for 10 or 15 minutes on the economy. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much to Charles and Menas to inviting me to speak today, and thank you to Emma and Beasley for sponsoring the event. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to provide some broad comments on the macroeconomic picture rather than necessarily the political side of it, and also to provide a bit of maybe an international context for developments in sub-Saharan Africa. So in terms of the first slide, we'll just kick off with a regional overview. We're some 6 months into the pandemic now, and the immediate economic impacts are becoming better understood, both in Africa and elsewhere, of course. I won't go into all the details, and we don't have time to do that either. And I must stress that the countries aren't all the same. In sub-Saharan Africa, the impact hasn't been uniform, but most policymakers have responded in an orthodox way, and I would say have done a reasonably good job. Still, the region is expected to slip into recession this year. That's not unusual. Most of the world is. As Patrick says, minus 3.2% growth this year for sub-Saharan Africa is projected by the IMF. That is a June forecast, so it's now a little bit dated, and we'll probably get an update, or we should get an update in the World Economic Outlook review next month from the fund, so we'll be looking at that carefully. But within that forecast that we have from June, there is a wide range of performance. We have some countries that are going to see a collapse in GDP of 10% or more this year. So Botswana, Mauritius, Seychelles, Zimbabwe, for instance. And at the other end of the spectrum, we'll have some countries that will see modest, that's all we're going to get this year at best, modest positive growth in East Africa, some of the Francophone Africa, and Ghana. Benin at 2.2% growth this year might be one of the best performing, say, frontier countries in the region. We know GDP fell sharply in Q2 across sub-Saharan Africa as it did elsewhere around the world due to the imposition of national lockdowns. Although Africa probably hasn't seen as worse a performance as we've seen in other EM, when you look at Peru, which saw GDP decline of over 30% year on year. And we're also still waiting for a lot of the data for some of these countries to really understand what was going on. But there are risks, of course, going forward. So I'll discuss some of these as we see them. So, no, previous slide. Sorry, Charles. That's it. Thank you. So we have obviously concerns about the first wave. We're still in the first wave in much of Africa, but also the second wave that we're beginning to see elsewhere, and maybe that would also come back in Africa. So that is something to watch. But with the exception of, say, South Africa, I think across Africa, infections and sadly, obviously, the death rate has been well contained, although I do take Patrick's point about the reliability of some of the statistics there. We're expecting a V-shaped global recovery, or most commentators are expecting a V-shaped global recovery. The IMF is looking at 3% plus next year, but there is a risk of slower domestic recoveries in Africa and elsewhere if that doesn't materialize, and the impact on long-term growth rates is still unknown. Across the region, there is limited policy space to support recoveries. That's because of the increase in inflation in some countries, notably in Nigeria and Ghana, and also rising debt burdens across the region, again, notably in Angola and Ghana. We might also see the possible emergence of social pressures. Warnings of a lost decade have been made, and that's pertinent when countries are in election cycles, as we have some this year, and something that Patrick spoke about. According to IMF data, per capita income this year could fall back to levels last seen in 2010. There's also large financing needs across the region. That's a function of the wider budget deficits that we are seeing. Obviously, that needs to be met from both external or domestic sources, can be problematic. And there are calls for debt relief within the presence of the DSSI or other initiatives which could hinder the recovery in investor sentiment. Next slide. Thank you. I won't dwell on the infection data. I think they've been well known and well reported, but I wanted to highlight the second chart here at the bottom right, This is the stringency index from Oxford University. It shows how governments have responded across the world through different measures and restrictions. I think the key takeaway for me on this particular chart is that sub-Saharan Africa is normal. I don't think there's anything really unusual about what we've seen across the region when we look at it in comparison to other places. Yes, we've seen some of the loosest restrictions. Look at Tanzania, which I think has been met with some consternation, but we've also seen some of the tightest restrictions if you look at, say, Ethiopia or Angola. And of course, there are many in between. Next slide. So countries around the world have been helped, of course, by the official sectors, the international response, not least those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This has included bilateral debt service relief under the G20's debt service suspension initiative. Of the 6 countries in SSA, excluding South Africa, with Eurobonds, which are highlighted at the top of this table, all but 3 are eligible for debt relief under that initiative. And of those, about half have received relief from the Paris Club to date, the latest being Angola on the 31st of August. Some countries that are eligible are, however, treading carefully, notably Ghana, Kenya and Nigeria, treading carefully for fear of what participation might mean for their rating, their sovereign rating, and their ability to access the market. That said, Moody's recently, a few weeks ago, lifted its review for a possible downgrade on some countries that were pursuing this initiative, which may provide some relief to some sovereign nations. The IMF has also played a big role in providing emergency financing and debt relief through its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, the CCRT, for poor countries. On emergency financing, some 76 countries, over 76 countries worldwide have benefited. In sub-Saharan Africa, nearly all the countries with Eurobonds have benefited somehow from emergency financing or other disbursements from the IMF. The total support so far, excluding South Africa, is about $11 billion. Next slide. Could you go to the next slide? That's it, thank you. No, I think back 3. That's it. So in terms of the policy response, the macroeconomic policy response, this has been largely orthodox across sub-Saharan Africa. As central banks have acted quickly to cut policy rates, as we saw in many advanced economies at the early stages of the crisis. Governments have also allowed the fiscal deficits to widen as a reflection of higher health and public spending and lower tax revenues. But that widening has been to varying degrees, and it's notable that the fiscal response has been much more limited in Africa relative to what we've seen in advanced economies and large EM, obviously given budget constraints. We've seen fiscal stimulus in advanced economies of double-digit packages as a percentage of GDP. In Africa, we're talking maybe 2 or 3 percentage points on average. So the ability in fiscal sense to support the recovery or support activity has been more limited. There are also debt problems that have been emerging or have been emerging for some time, notably in Zambia and Angola. If you turn to the next slide. So needless to say, these developments have been reflected in financial asset market performance. Many currencies across the region have weakened, but that's not unusual. Many emerging market currencies have also weakened this year, notably Brazil and Turkey. Bond yields and bond spreads on dollar bonds, for instance, have also widened quite sharply, but yields have recovered from their initial spike in March, April at the depth of the global market panic, but probably haven't recovered to their pre-crisis levels in a number of countries. And we're seeing this sort of tiering between the better credits, maybe the middle credits, and some of the weaker credits, maybe more of a discrepancy than we saw pre-crisis. Still, sub-Saharan African issuers may be paying a premium compared to other issuers, possibly reflecting debt relief concerns on bonds. I think the other thing to add here, of course, is that although sovereign emerging market bond issuance has resumed following the market closure in March, April, no sub-Saharan African country has yet come to the market. So that appetite still has to be tested, although borrowing costs for some suggest that they are not priced out of the market. Go to the next slide. So I'll just finish with two more slides on Ivory Coast and Ghana, just to give particular country cases, the country cases with elections, of course, this year that have Eurobonds and therefore are probably most relevant to investors. I'll start with Côte d'Ivoire. I think in common to my comments about the region as a whole, Francophone Africa has also seen an impact in terms of slowing growth, but the impact hasn't been uniform. Some countries are slowing more than others. Some will remain positive. For instance, Côte d'Ivoire is expected to still see positive growth this year. And that partly reflects the momentum coming into this year that it and others had. So some countries were better placed, I think, coming to this crisis than others. The authorities have taken significant policy steps. We're seeing a widening or an expected widening in the budget deficit in Côte d'Ivoire this year of the order 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP, which is arguably necessary, but certainly not as scary as we might be seeing in some other countries. I won't dwell on the political dynamics given what Patrick has said, but clearly the outcome and the process around the election will be important in terms of market sentiment and domestic sentiment. We don't want to see a repeat of what we saw a decade ago. I think there is obviously unrest given the situation in terms of Ouattara standing again, but we hope that that can all be contained and that the election can take place smoothly. And I think whatever happens, investors will look to see the track record and the policy framework of whoever wins. And obviously on that point, Ouattara's got a very good track record. So I think markets would be quite pleased if he were to resume in a smooth way, let's say. And then finally on Ghana, Ghana has been hit hard by the pandemic. Many other countries have. Of course, it is going to see a slowdown in growth, maybe to 1.5% this year from last year's 6.5%, and strong growth over the last pretty much the last decade. So it will see a weakening, which is not unusual, but I think what probably differentiates it now is that we are seeing higher inflation. We're seeing reserves ease a little bit as the currency remains stable, but we're also seeing this fiscal deterioration, which S&P warned about at the end of last week and downgraded its rating to B-. They're expecting now a double-digit fiscal deficit of the order 13.5 percentage points of GDP. The government itself is expecting 11%, so maybe they're aligned, but you can clearly see some risk of downside risks there. And obviously, I think what will matter is the ability of the next administration, whoever it is, and I don't see much difference in their macroeconomic policy agendas at the broad level. I think what will matter is what their policies will be and how they react, and I hope to try and implement some sort of consolidation plan to keep the fiscal and debt sustainability trajectory on a downward trend. I shall finish there, Charles, and we can move to Q&A because I'm sure there are going to be loads.